We all have had our fair share of nightmares when we were kids. Some of them were easily forgettable by the next day, and others still being imprinted into our minds to this very day. It's rather odd how our brains tend to work sometimes when it comes to having to deal with dreams, but at the same time, it's also the most fascinating as well. The fact that something that we all know isn't real could build up such a great amount of fear in the span of just a few minutes is impressive. I myself actually remember one such nightmare that I had back when I was only 4 years old. From what I can remember, it involved me in one of the bedrooms of my grandmother's house, jumping on the bed with all the characters from Sesame Street, and I do mean everyone. Big Bird, Bert and Ernie, Cookie Monster, Daisy, just basically everybody. Honestly, even a couple that I couldn't even really recall. Although, judging by it, it might have just been a couple of randomly generated ones that my brain wanted to put out. Now, sure enough, everything was going fine up until the point where I noticed that Elmo wasn't anywhere on the bed. That's when I remember stopping jumping at that point and turning to Big Bird and asking him where Elmo was at. That's when Big Bird stopped jumping as well. He then turned to me with a very serious look on his face. Then, in the most serious voice I think I honestly could have ever came up in my mind, he said, "He's on the side of the bed. He's angry." I then wind up plopping down on the bed and looking over at the edge of it, only to find Elmo sitting up with angry eyebrows staring up at me. God, even thinking about that still gives me the chills. I'm not gonna lie. That dream alone traumatized me as a kid. And for the next 3 years, I didn't have anything to do with Elmo or any kind of Elmo toys. Hell, even now I can't look at that creepy fucking Muppet the same way without cringing a little. But like with what I had just said above, everyone has their fair share of nightmares throughout their youth. Now think about something that would be 10 times worse for a child than just a nightmare. Likely chances that would be a little something called the Boogyman. Yes, the Boogyman, an entity that has terrified more children during they slept at night than any other kind of monster. Oftentimes, this monster would supposedly reside in things like dark closets, hallways, bedrooms, underneath the bed, and many, many, many more places. Now, what this Boogeyman is really up to the kids who imagine it. Personally, for me, it was, like in my dream, Elmo. I honestly can't tell you how many times I wind up waking up, seeing one of those little Elmo plushies that sat next to my bed staring at me at night, slowly consuming my soul as I sat there and just stared at it with pure unadulterated fear. God. Of course, it's a rather irrational fear for the most part, something that kids and the like really don't need to truly be afraid of. This is a message that's often spoken by parents and babysitters for a long time, every time a kid winds up saying that they're afraid of the boogeyman. Basically saying that there really is nothing truly to be afraid of, and that it's all in our minds and it'll ultimately go away. Even cartoons and other kid shows have touched on this topic in a multitude of ways. But more often than not, the episode themselves would ultimately end in the same way, with the message being spoken by either a parent or an older sibling, and the kid would either be able to get rid of them entirely by forgetting about them, or the monster would ultimately disappear on its own midway through scaring them. However, not all shows tend to do the same kind of concept that others were doing at the time when it came to having to deal with nightmares and the boogeyman. Some would go a little bit far and try and use this concept to try and scare kids for a special. Think of Goosebumps as an example. Or use it in another way to tell a different kind of story or message. One of these shows that used this concept was a show by the name of Max and Ruby. That might come as a bit of a shock to some of you, but rest assured, that was the case. Now you all might just be wondering, or attempting to try and recall, if this episode was ever shown to the public. And the answer to that question is a simple no. This episode, for reasons that have yet to be disclosed, wasn't aired for the program and simply shelved away into the rejection pile that most banned and canceled episodes or shows would go into Viacom headquarters to simply decay into nothingness in an old room. Well, for the most part, many executives thought that it was the end of that. That is, however, until a few years ago. While it may not have hit many newspapers or any other news sites at the time, there was an incident that happened at around November 30th, 2016, where a few men had broken into Viacom networks and stole at least 30 of these banned episodes from their room/vault. The motive behind these thefts wasn't really specified at the time, but if rumor serves me right, it was done by a few rogue YouTubers who apparently had been sick and tired of Viacom's illegal actions with their false copyright claims and their lack of obeying the fair use clause, and in the process, likely ruining their favorite content creators in the process. And this was pretty much their way of not only fighting back, as there was really no other manner or way of doing it, but also doing what they possibly could to try and expose the company and have them be either exposed and completely and utterly bankrupted or just shut down entirely. How exactly they were actually going to do that? Simple. By taking all the episodes that they had stolen and uploading them into various media sharing websites. One of these being the Max and Ruby episode that I mentioned earlier. Now, I'd actually managed to download a copy of this episode from one of the sites that it was shared onto after finding it. It was honestly a good thing that I had done that at the time, as the site had been taken down by Viacom about a few months after the whole incident surrounding the leaked videos. Yeah, Viacom wasn't taking any kind of chances with having their already shitty reputation being dragged through the mud any more than it already was. So they went and did everything in their power to take down each and every one of these videos, even if it meant taking down sites that hosted them getting shut down as well. There was also a warning posted on Viacom's official website for a short period of time, threatening anyone with a hefty lawsuit if they were either found with or caught distributing these episodes to anyone on any video sharing website. So, for that reason, I'm not going to be able to show the video to anyone. But at least I do know that if for some reason this post or anything else gets targeted, I could simply practically argue that it's simply a made-up story and that it's not meant to be taken seriously or something, and of course, my ass will be saved. Now, the episode in question was entitled The Boogyman, and I do apologize for not mentioning the name of it earlier in the post. This episode began with a typical Max and Ruby startup intro, with both of the bunnies doing their usual things that they tend to do during, the intro. Once it finally ended, the scene then transitioned over to show the front view of the house that Max and Ruby lived in. At night, with the sound of crickets and other insects filling the scene with pleasant noises. The camera then panned over towards one of the second-story windows, before cutting to show Ruby in her PJs, helping Max put on his as well. She's struggling a little bit, trying to put Max's shirt on, but after a few tugs, she finally succeeds with pulling the shirt over Max's head. She then lets out a small little huff before saying, "Well, that was certainly a workout." Max only giggled a little bit at what Ruby had said, before Ruby wiped her forehead and immediately spoke, saying, "I think it's best, Max, that we cut out the cakes and desserts for a little bit. You're starting to get a little bit too big for your clothes," Ruby said. Max's giggles soon dropped down to a rather annoyed glare as he stared up at his sister with a "really?" kind of look. Ruby notices this and immediately does what she possibly can to try and, apologize. "I'm sorry, Max. I didn't mean it that way. It's just that, Max simply rolled his eyes at his sister's supposed explanation and then let out a loud yawn, to which Ruby did the same. "Well, Max, it's been a long day today, but I think it's time for the two of us to get some shut-eye," Ruby said mid-yawn. Max nodded his head in agreement before making his way over towards his bed, with Ruby helping him in the process. Max then snuggled up into the covers of his bed and then begins making himself comfortable. Ruby then proceeds to make her way towards Max's bedroom door, opens it up, and then makes her way out of Max's room before sticking her head out and saying, "Good night, Max," and then closing the door shut. "Good night, Ruby," Max replied back. Ruby then proceeded to switch off the lights before making her way out of Max's room and towards her own. The scene then switched back to show Max snuggling up in bed with his red elephant toy, relaxing and soon falling asleep. The scene then transitioned over back to Max in his bed, supposedly late at night, completely asleep and without a care in the world. Suddenly, the sound of the door creaking open wakes the young bunny out of his sleep. Dazed and a bit confused, Max opens his eyes slowly, and he glances over where the sound of the creaking noise had come from. Max had immediately stared at the closet door, which only slightly moved just a little bit before stopping immediately. Max's eyes grow wide as he saw the door suddenly stop. Seeing this, Max immediately got out of bed and began running out of his room, down the hall and towards Ruby's room. The camera then cut to show Ruby sleeping peacefully in her bed with all of her dolls lying right next to her. However, her peaceful sleep is suddenly cut short when Max immediately barged into the room. Ruby, who now jumped out of fright, immediately wakes up and clicks on her bedside lamp. She looks over, and the scene quickly pans to show Max, with a rather unnerved expression on his face. Ruby sees this and immediately is worried. "Max, what are you doing up so late?" Ruby asked calmly as she looked over at her brother. Max didn't say anything at first, and this immediately gets her sister's attention. "What's wrong, Max? Is everything okay?" Ruby asked again, now getting out of bed. "Boogeyman," Max said, pointing towards his room. Ruby blinks a bit, obviously confused at what Max was saying. However, it seemed to immediately come up over to her. She pressed on a little bit more, though. "The Boogeyman?" Ruby questioned. Max nodded his head, and Ruby simply gave a small smile and began leading Max back into his room. "Max, you don't need to worry about the Boogeyman. He isn't real," Ruby said. The two then make their way back into Max's room. Upon doing so, Ruby immediately turns on the light to the room and begins to search around the place with Max. Ruby then stands at the middle of Max's room and then smiles. "You see, Max, there isn't anybody here," Ruby begins. "No Boogeyman in sight." Max then immediately pointed towards his open closet door. "Boogeyman!" he said again. Ruby noticed this, and then immediately made her way over towards the closet door and immediately shut it tight. "There, nice and closed. I doubt any more boogeymen are going to be getting through that after I wind up closing it shut," Ruby said. Max now had a completely relieved look on his face, seeing as how the closet had now been officially closed up by Ruby. "Come on, Max, let's get you back to bed," Ruby said, grabbing Max's hand and leading him back towards his bed. Ruby then helped Max back up into his bed, making sure to tuck him in as tightly as she did. She then made her way back to the bedroom door before saying goodnight to Max once again, and closing the door shut before turning the lights out. The scene then cut back to show Max, now completely and utterly relieved, fall immediately right back to sleep in his bed. The scene then transitioned over to show the front of the house, this time on the second night, before panning back over to Max's room, with Ruby helping Max once again with his clothing before helping him into bed. The two share another good night towards one another. Before, like earlier, Ruby turns the lights off and closes the door shut. Max then lied down on the bed and began to cuddle with his robot this time, and then began to doze off once more. However, compared to last time, he didn't get to sleep for too long, judging by the alarm clock that was sitting next to him. And the next scene showed the closet door opening once again, but this time a little bit faster. Max this time around didn't flutter awake. His eyes immediately shot open and he darted open and then sat up in a hair's pace. He didn't leave his bed this time, but instead looked at the open closet door intently, awaiting something. However, the only thing that did come was a faint tapping, coming from the little doorknob that had opened the closet door. It was rather faint, but still audible. This time around, Max didn't hesitate to run back to his sister's room, awakening her once again in the process. Ruby opened her eyes and saw Max from the light of the moonlight outside. She sat up and glanced at him. "Max, what's wrong?" Ruby said groggily. "Boogeyman," Max answered, this time a bit more terrified. "Oh, Max," Ruby said as she once again made her way to Max back to his room. Ruby immediately turned the lights on in his room and, like before, found nothing. She reassured Max that everything was fine and that there wasn't a boogeyman coming after him. Again, Max pointed towards the closet door, and Ruby simply closed them before leading Max to his bed once again. Ruby then said her goodnights to Max again and then left the room. The scene then cut back to show Max lying there, completely unnerved but slightly content at the same time, before quickly falling back asleep in the process. As you might expect, this continued on for a good portion of the episode, with each time growing in severity as it did. The third night that Max is woken up, he was awoken to not only the closet door opening, but a small series of claws barely catching Max's eyes. And the fourth night, the same thing happens, but this time the claws are much more visible, and a slight chuckle comes from the inside of the closet. The fifth night has the same thing, but this time with the thing's smile, which is really creepy looking by the way, flashing in the dark for a bit as the door opens up. The sixth was the same, but with much more detail given to the boogeyman's smile in the process. As for Ruby, each time, she did everything that she could possibly think to try and help Max as best as she could. The third night that she had to deal with all that, she gave Max a small bottle of what she called Boogeyman repellent, which was simply water in a spray bottle. This was ineffective at doing much of anything. The fourth night, Ruby gave Max a little nightlight from her bedside table. But just as the closet showed up on the door in Max's closet, the nightlight burst. The fifth and sixth night just had Ruby letting Max sleep into her bed for the night, but the same thing would happen just in Ruby's closet. It was rather obvious, as the episode progressed, that this was taking a huge chunk out of Ruby, while simultaneously scaring the ever-living shit out of Max. However, everything took a complete nosedive in the form of absolute nightmare fuel when the seventh and final night came along. This time around in this scene, Max was alone to dress himself. However, it was obvious that he really didn't want to go to bed in his room that night. But earlier in the episode, Ruby had made it clear to him that she didn't want any more issues, as she herself needed to get her beauty sleep. So Max was in his room. He had already gotten his PJs on without any issues. The camera then panned over towards the closet door, which was still shut by the way, and then back at Max. Max then immediately looked around the room, and then walked over to a small chair that was near his desk. He then immediately picked the chair up and then brought it back over to the closet door, and placed it as close to the doorknob of the closet as it possibly could. Then he got into bed, turned out the lights, and then attempted to fall asleep. This was only successful for a few moments before the sound of the chair that Max had put next to the closet door fell over on its side. Max immediately bolted upright and looked over, only for the camera to come back to show that the chair had indeed fallen to the ground. Not only that, but the door slowly began to open up, before finally being left wide open. What came next was a scene that, if I was any younger, would have made me shit and piss myself at the same time. The moonlight that was illuminating the scene showed a rather disturbing sight. It was a large bunny, with a rather long and fucking toothy grin on its face. His eyes were widened and slightly bloodshot, which only added to the creep factor of this episode. His body was also clothed in a simple shirt and jeans, but they looked completely tattered and very dirty. To wrap up the shit-your-pants nightmare, the boogeyman, started to breathe deeply. In and out. In and out. Not blinking, or really doing much of anything, other than breathing. The scene then cut back to Max, whose expression was nothing less than terrified. He was shaking like a leaf and held the covers over his face to try and block out the figure. The thing only kept on looking at him, before lifting up one of his dirty paws and pointing right at the young bunny. "Yummy," was the only thing it gargled out before a large and wide shadow started to envelope the entire scene, rather slowly. Max immediately got up and ran out in the door, crying all the way through as he ran back into Ruby's room in a panic. Ruby, having already been awakened by her brother's crying, asked her little brother, "Max, what's wrong? Are you hurt? Are you in pain?" Ruby said, panicking. "No, Boogeyman," Max said in between sobs. Then something happened. Ruby's demeanor then hit a complete 180, and her worried expression soon turned into one of complete agitation and slight anger. "Max, how many times do we have to keep on doing this?" Ruby began. "There is no Boogeyman. He doesn't exist, Max. You should know that by now." Max was going to say something, but was stopped when Ruby continued to berate him. "I've done everything that I could do, Max, to help you with your problem, but nothing's worked so far. You just need to go back to your room and stop bothering me with a Boogeyman that doesn't even exist," Ruby snapped. "But," Max said, shuddering. "No buts, Max. You need to fight this on your own. Now march your little tail back into the room now, young man," Ruby snapped once again. Max didn't move. "Right now, Max! I am not in the mood for games anymore. It's late. I have not slept in days. Now go to your room, go to bed, or so help me, Max, you will never play with any of your toys ever again. You hear me?" Max simply lowered his head down and nodded sadly. "Good. Now march," Ruby said as she practically dragged her scared younger brother back to his room before shoving him back into his room and slamming his door shut. The scene simply stayed on Max now, with him whimpering to himself as he carefully stared over at the closet. The scene then cut to show the closet door had been completely shut, and there was nothing else more. Max sighed with relief and started to make his way back over towards his bed, checking underneath it to make sure of it that the Boogeyman wasn't there. Thankfully, there was no one. After climbing up on the bed, Max took one last look at the closet door and saw that it was still closed. Max then closed his eyes peacefully and began to drift off to sleep. That is, when completely out of nowhere, the dirty paws from the Boogeyman immediately clamped itself down onto Max's mouth, muffling his scream. Max's eyes shot open and he struggled to try and get out of its grasp. The camera immediately cut to show the nasty and horrifying face of the Boogeyman staring right down at him, with drool coming out of his enlarged mouth. "Yummy," the creature said before the scene immediately cut to black. It soon returned to show a new scene this time. Ruby's room in the daytime. Ruby yawned and then woke up, greeting her dolls as she usually did so. She then got up from her bed and then began to make her way over towards her vanity set and start to prep herself up for the day. "Well, I certainly had a nice night tonight," Ruby said, before her face immediately fell. Of course, Max had to come in and interrupt it. But seeing how scared he was, and the way that I yelled at him too, that wasn't really nice of me to do that to him. I mean, I remember being scared of the closet when I was younger, and Mom and Dad never had a problem with me going up and sleeping in their bedroom. Ruby immediately got up from her vanity set, and then made her way over towards the hallway. "I think I should go and apologize to Max with the way I acted. I think I'll make it up by him for making him some chocolate chip pancakes for breakfast," Ruby said, her demeanor lighting up a bit. She then made her way over towards Max's room, Max's door, and then knocked on it. "Max? Hey, I'm sorry about last night, Ruby said. No answer. Ruby knocked again. I'll make sure of it to make it up to you by making you some delicious chocolate chip pancakes. Your favorite. How does that sound? Ruby said in a rather sing-song kind of tone. Still, no response. Ruby, now rather concerned, immediately opened up the door to her brother's room and gasped in shock when she entered into it. The entire room was trashed. Toys were scattered everywhere. There was glass from the window that was broken, lying in pieces next to the bed. Parts of the furniture that were in his room were broken into pieces, and the bed looked as if someone had been dragged from it. Ruby, now horrified, started to call out her brother's name. However, each time she called out, there was no answer. She soon started to search around for any sign of Max, but found nothing. That is until she wound up reaching the closet door, which was the only thing that looked completely normal. Slowly and with much hesitation, she opened it up, only for her face to completely contort into a look of pure horror and fear as it finally opened all the way through. She took a few steps back from the closet, and then, after a few breaths, let out a loud scream. As she screamed, the camera slowly panned down on the closet floor, only just showing a little bit of what Ruby saw in the closet. Max's leg, still dressed in the PJ that he had worn that night, still attached to the rest of him, but nothing else was shown. Then, like that, the episode ended right then and there, with the credits and like playing in the very end. Honestly, I didn't know what the hell it was that I had watched, and to be honest, I don't even think I want to know. That episode, dear God, what was that? I mean, this episode was dark, especially for a show like Nick Jr. Apart from the creepy vibe, there was a lot of stuff wrong with this. I mean, the fucked up face from the Boogyman, all the horrifying shit that went on in that episode, and that one final shot of Max's leg with Ruby's horrified screams and face playing in the background. Jesus Christ, I'm not gonna get that shit out of my head. Honestly, though, it's likely that this either wasn't 100% finished up or was a single part to who knows how many parts this episode was going to have, due to the sudden ending that it had. But then again, maybe that actually was the ending of it. But I could be wrong, though. Still, I often question what was going on at that studio that came up with something as dark as an episode like this. Maybe that was the reason why this wasn't shown, and confiscated by Viacom as well. Although in retrospect, thinking on it, as much as I hate Viacom, I can understand the issues that would come by if this was further leaked to the public. Who honestly knows how many kids would get fucked up just by seeing this episode? And likely chances the other episodes that's still likely are around, all over the web, and have yet to actually be discovered. Who honestly knows?
In fear and surprise, as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping horror-driven nightmarish gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at